This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Thank you for coming. I know you made quite the trip from Palm Springs, and with it you brought some lovely weather, so double thank you. And you have brought us this case, which I presume houses the reason for your visit.
A painting.
Well, let's open it.
I'll let you take that out.
It's much smaller than I thought it would be.
It's a cabinet portrait.
Okay, and is cabinet portrait, is that a technical term for this?
It's kind of a technical term for a small size painting that you might put on a small easel on a table or something like that, as opposed to hanging it on a wall.
All right, so as I get rid of this stuff, why don't you kind of tell me a little bit about this painting, who it's a portrait of, who the artist is, and why you traveled all the way from Palm Springs to Chicago with this painting.
It's supposed to be a portrait of Lady Jane Grey.
And she was the Queen of England, right? But only for like a week or something?
Well, supposedly 9 days, actually 13.
Okay.
In July of 1553. Her great uncle was Henry VIII.
Okay.
He had a son, Edward VI, who became king when Henry died. But then Edward VI died as a teenager.
Okay.
Edward VI had two half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. He did not want either of them to be queen.
Oh.
She was his cousin. Her mother is Henry VIII's niece.
Okay, so
she was in the line of succession.
A little circuitous, but
Yes.
she gets there eventually.
Yes.
So she becomes queen. Why did she become unqueen?
The people didn't like that idea.
Oh, they don't like anointed.
They didn't want the line of succession to skip over anybody. The population supported Edward's sister Mary as the rightful heir next in line of succession.
Was she more charismatic or something?
She was known as the Princess Mary, who was destined to inherit.
Oh, okay.
Nobody knew who Jane Grey was.
So this was a bait and switch. They kind of,
Yes,
they
basically.
wanted Mary, they knew Mary, they were expecting Mary, and then Jane comes along and
Exactly.
the people felt not so great about it.
The people resisted and went to Mary instead. Mary raised an army. She marched on London.
Really?
And Jane was deposed.
So she was fired?
Deposed is the word we use.
All right. Did she keep her head?
She did not. She was executed in February of 1554 at the age of 17.
Okay, so she's 17,
Correct.
right? She's married, she's living her life. She's kind of royal adjacent, cousin, maybe, you know, it's nice to tell a dinner party, my cousin's the king. She becomes queen, they make her queen. You don't, when you're 17, you don't say no when they say
Right.
you're queen.
Suppose you could, but
You'd
who
probably
would?
be executed if
Who
you said
would?
no. Right, yeah,
I
right,
mean,
who
why would you?
Yeah, you're 17, you're the Queen of England,
Be
right?
the richest person in the country.
So she assumes the throne, she's measuring for drapes, moving in, right? And then they say, you're out.
Because she had assumed the title of queen wrongfully, that's treason, you die.
Get out of here. They try her for treason and execute her. All because she did what she was told to do.
Correct.
Jeez, all at 17, huh? And talk about my teenage years being rough. That is quite a story. Tell me about the painting itself.
Well, the painting itself is on wood panel.
Right.
It's an oak wood panel.
And it's in great condition. It looks like it's been really well cared
A
for.
little bit of warpage, but not too bad considering its age.
Yep.
We don't know who the artist is yet. The dendrochronologists that examined the wood of the painting to give me a date for the wood think that there is another panel from the same tree, and they think they know where that panel is, and that may tell us who the artist is.
Oh, wow. So, you know, obviously when they fell a tree, the sawyer cuts it, they'll select the best woods. The workshop, the artists will get those, and, you know, they're going to go buy 5, 6, 7 panels at
Right.
a time, buy a bunch, and they'll use them in their production.
Correct.
So there might be a companion piece of wood
Exactly.
from a known artist
Exactly.
that would maybe not give us the 100% certainty, but at least it's that workshop or that
Exactly.
school, that kind of circle.
Exactly. We
That's
can say
really
workshop of.
Right, that's really fantastic. You seem to know a lot about Jane Grey, about this painting, about dendrochronology, about the other artists. Who are you?
Well, I'm John Stephen Edwards, I have a PhD in British history, and I specialize in Jane Grey specifically.
Okay, so this is
my niche.
This is your field of expertise, and in this field, you're the man, right?
Correct, particularly in art history, history of her portraiture. I have recently published a book on portraits of Lady Jane Grey.
Okay.
And I've done work with like the National Portrait Gallery and a lot of the big private collections in the United Kingdom and even some museums here in the United States.
Okay, and so what do you hope the conservation process is going to yield for this piece?
The main thing that I'm hoping for is to bring up the image better, get rid of this old varnish so that we can read the inscription more clearly, so that we can see the details more clearly. And then if we can determine whether this inscription is original to the painting or was added later, that's critically important, because there are dozens, literally, of paintings that are supposed to depict Jane Grey that have inscriptions on them saying this is Lady Jane Grey. Yeah. But then you look at the costume and it's from 100, 150, 200 years after she died. And at this point, there is no authentic portrait of Lady Jane Grey known.
Okay, so there's no official portrait of her. This is it.
We do know that a portrait of her existed at one point. Her family was very close to a woman known to history as Bess of Hardwicke, who built Chatsworth House originally. And an inventory from Chatsworth House from about 1559, 1560 has a portrait of Jane Grey listed that Bess kept in her bedchamber. So we know that Bess of Hardwicke had a portrait of Jane. We know that Bess knew Jane very, very well. So that portrait had to have been an authentic likeness.
Right, so that's the Holy Grail.
But it's disappeared. That is the Holy Grail.
And it
has disappeared.
Of course.
My personal hope for this picture is to determine whether or not this might be a copy of that lost Chatsworth portrait.
Oh, so a contemporary copy. We're hoping that this painting is a posthumous copy of the only known portrait of Lady Grey, which has now since disappeared.
Correct.
Which would put this kind of as the next best thing, the successor to the Holy Grail, which would be a pretty big deal, I presume.
Huge.
Yeah.
Be huge.
Right. Looking at the painting, I mean, I think you have a really solid painting. There's nothing fundamentally, from a technical perspective, conservation perspective, glaringly wrong with it.
Right.
It's old, it's beat up, it's scratched, it's dirty, it's got some chips. The wood is expanded and contracted a little bit, which is why we see all of these little vertical paint losses. That's where the grain is opened up and the paint's just kind of flaked off. And even though it does go through the face, which is not the best place for losses, it's the forehead and the cheek. It's not the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. So you've really kind of dodged all the bullets coming at this painting, particularly for being 400 plus years old. Paintings, unless they're kept in good condition, they don't last 400 years in a basement or bumming around an antique shop. They have to be well cared for.
It's almost as though someone put it in a closet and forgot about it for 400 years.
Yeah, which is kind of the best thing for a painting, right? Because it keeps it preserved and protected. So I think you have a really lucky survivor, and just what I can see based on this painting, I think that once we get this varnish off and get it cleaned, I think it's going to be a really, really gorgeous painting. And hopefully, deliver you back some good news and some good results.
That would be ideal.
For historians like John, research used to come through libraries and dusty tomes, but now most of it's done online. And that's great because there's so much information. Until you realize that all of those websites were built in 1992 and hardly usable now. But it doesn't have to be that way, at least not with Squarespace. With one of their beautifully designed, mobile-friendly templates, your passion, your artwork, your business will shine. And with their new fluid design technology, you can drag and drop elements around your website to change things up or customize it as you see fit without the need of any code. But that doesn't mean it's just a pretty website. Under the hood is massive technology. From search engine optimization, e-commerce solutions, mailing lists, online scheduling, social media integration, shipping solutions, and more. Pretty much everything you need to run a successful business. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Per John's request, I'm going to be examining this painting under microscope, but not a big old-fashioned one. Here I'm using a little digital one that's a couple of years old, so the images are not as high resolution as they could be, but they'll suffice. We're not trying to look at this painting on a molecular level, we're just trying to take a closer look at this inscription to see if it exhibits any telltale signs of being added later, if it stands out or is floating atop the surface. And what I can see is that it is underneath the varnish layer. You see these areas of brighter yellow on some of the high points in the inscription, and particularly that spot right there where the inscription crosses over a dent or a crack in the wood. These all lead me to believe that this was applied at the same time as the execution of the painting and not later. While I have the microscope out, I'm going to take a look at some of the other areas of the painting, the jewels and the crest, just to see, because I can. And what I'm noticing is the extreme precision with which all of this was painted. These tiny little brush strokes are clearly visible here. The intricacies of the jewels, the highlights, whoever painted this was talented and skilled. And of course, we'll take a look at the eyes as well. And under magnification, the most important part of the painting, well, it's just a couple of brush strokes of paint. Nothing more, nothing less. In addition to a visual and microscopic examination, John asked me to take some ultraviolet and infrared photographs to see what we can't see with the naked eye. Now this camera is a modified digital camera. It has all of the cut filters removed, so the sensor is receptive to a broader spectrum of light, including infrared and UV. I'll set up my halogen lamps, which produce enough radiation, and then, using a special combination of filters, I'll take some photographs. And these filters allow only the infrared wavelength to pass through, not the ultraviolet or visible light. And I'll do the same thing with different filters with my ultraviolet lights. And after that, I'll have the painting X-rayed. Now, I don't yet have that technology in the studio yet, because I don't use X-ray equipment all that often. But when I need it, like in this case, I invite a mobile tech company into the studio who I've worked with for many years, and they send their technicians out and they X-ray the painting. And it's really cool to have them in the studio, not only because they love this departure from their normal work, but because I get to learn from them about how to best apply this technology. Because maybe one day in the future, I will have a rig of my own. But for now, I leave it to the pros. Now, after all of that looking and photographing and x-raying and putzing around, I can actually start to get to work. The first thing that I'm going to do is remove all of this tape and adhesive residue from the back of this panel. Now, it's not terrible to have this here, but the painting is in the studio, so why not remove what shouldn't be there? This was obviously added at a later date when the painting was framed, and the residue never removed when it was unframed. So using a little bit of laponite, the synthetic clay that absorbs water and swells adhesives, I'll apply it on the back of the paper and let it sit. Where there is a pressure-sensitive tape residue, think something like Scotch tape or packing tape, I'll use a little bit of solvent to dissolve it and remove it with a cotton ball. It takes a couple of passes to remove that pressure-sensitive adhesive, another sign that pressure-sensitive tape belongs nowhere near artwork. And while I'm doing that, the glue in the paper tape has swollen and I can come back with a relatively dull scalpel blade. I can begin removing all of this tape and the residue. I want a dull scalpel here because I'm really not looking to cut or slice anything. I just need a blunt edge to remove all of this stuff. And it goes fairly quickly, and in some spots it comes off in one fell swoop, which is always welcome. In some spots, it takes a little bit more work, but eventually I will get all of this residue off and the painting will be free of all this tape and this glue. A quick pass to remove any residues, and this part is all complete. With all of the work on the back of the panel now complete, my attention can turn to the front and removing the accumulated surface grime and the old natural and synthetic resins that have been applied onto this painting. And the first step is using a neutral organic soap that we mix in the studio to break down and remove that accumulated surface grime. This is dust, dirt, oils, tobacco, all the gunk that sits on the surface. And this neutral organic soap will not affect the varnish. And you can see, yeah, there is a little bit of grime on the surface. So I'll go ahead and remove it from the entire painting because that grime can interfere with the other soaps and detergents and solvents that I'm going to use in the future. So I'll apply it, I'll agitate it, and then remove it with a cotton ball. And it turns out there was a pretty heavy accumulation, so I'm glad that I did this step. Next is testing which of the resin soaps I have in my studio are going to best remove the natural resin varnish. Now, these resin soaps are designed to be used where solvents may be too aggressive, or I just don't feel like that's the right approach, and each one operates a little bit differently, which is why I'm testing all three of them. I'll apply them with a little brush and let them sit, and then I'll come back with a swab and agitate to see which one is the most effective at removing the natural resin without affecting the paint layer. The first one does a pretty good job of removing a little. The second one does, well, about the same. And the third one is much more effective. So now I have a range of soaps that I can use. I'll apply the soap to the painting and then agitate it with the brush. These are much slower than using a solvent or solvent gel, so it takes a little bit more time and a little bit more agitation, and actually sometimes multiple passes to remove a significant amount of that natural resin. But it does remove it. And you can see as I agitate more and make more and more passes, more and more of that natural resin comes off. And what we eventually get to is the paint layer and all of those really beautiful colors that are underneath this very darkened resin. Now, for a small painting like this, it's not a problem that it's slow working, but for a gigantic painting, this could be really, really tedious. Lucky for me, this is a small painting. So I've applied it onto the painting and let it sit, agitated with my brush, and then I'm coming back with a swab and removing it. I'm using this hand-rolled swab because it's just a little bit more effective than using store-bought ones, and I have a little bit more control. So I'll continue doing this, working different areas and making sure that I get rid of all of that natural resin varnish. And you can see it is really slow. This is, 8-10 minutes of letting it sit. And when I come back with a little bit of neutralizing and clearing solvent, I can remove all of that old accumulated natural resin. And we can start to see the first hints of what's underneath all of that yellowed varnish. Just like I did in the other areas, the background is no different. I'll take care around this signature because it is pretty delicate, but ultimately it cleans up pretty well, just like the rest of the painting. Now, her skin is obviously the lightest part of this painting and where we're going to see the biggest difference. So I'll apply the gel and I'll just let it sit and work it with the brush, let it sit, and then come back and begin to remove it. Now, I mentioned that there were multiple coatings on this painting, and here we can start to see all of those coatings come up. When I first apply the resin soap, you can see the initial old varnish start to break down. And then as I agitate it, it gets darker, and that's the second coating of varnish. And then as I come back with the clearing solvent, I'm picking up what appears to be the third or maybe the fourth, and this feels a little bit different, maybe like it's a synthetic resin. And this is no surprise. Any painting of significant age has been worked on many, many times, and you're bound to have multiple layers of varnish. That usually happens when somebody is afraid to clean the painting or inexperienced, or they just want to brighten it up and they apply a new varnish on top of the old varnish because for a moment there, it does make it look brighter, but ultimately it all degrades over time and has to be removed. And that's what I'm doing now, lifting off all of those layers and revealing the original painting. And from the looks of it, it's turning out to be quite worth it. We're getting some really beautiful skin tones and a delicacy that just wasn't there before. Now onto the face. And here I'm really hoping that we get a really beautiful transformation to get rid of all of this yellow and see something glorious underneath. And it does not disappoint. We have some really beautiful, really delicate skin tones here, and something that feels more in line with a 17-year-old who's about to become queen. But it is slow going and it is delicate, and I'm going to work around her forehead and her cheeks and leave her eyes, nose, and mouth for last because really that's the most important part of her face. And also, as we saw when I looked at her eyes under microscope, it's just a few brush marks of paint, thin and transparent. And I don't want to take the chance that any of it is lost. So I leave it for the last bit of cleaning because then I have the most information about how the painting responds to these approaches that I'm using. If I need to use a milder detergent or something that's slightly different, I can do so. And having information about how the paint reacts allows me to modulate my approach accordingly. And so with these last wipes of the swab, we can see that she's going to look pretty great. Now, prior to any retouching, I'm going to apply a synthetic resin saturation or isolation layer to the painting. And if there was any reason why this is critically important, this is a perfect example. Look at how the colors change when this resin is applied, from dull and drab and washed out to saturated and vibrant. Now imagine if I retouched according to the dull and drab. Well, it just wouldn't look right when I applied the final varnish. So this resin allows me to see what the painting will look like when it's final varnished and match my colors accordingly. Now it's really shiny right now, but that will get corrected with the application of the final varnish after retouching. The retouching on this painting, just like the cleaning, is really minimal. There aren't major losses that need to be recreated. But what there are lots of small imperfections and distractions. And for a small painting, those are pretty large. So using a very, very, very tiny little brush, I'm just going through and trying to eliminate that distracts our eye. All of these little blemishes, these little spots where paint is chipped off or where there's an abrasion or discoloration, just so that we can see the whole. And while it may seem minimal and not all that important, when the painting is all complete, it will have a great impact on how we view and understand this artwork. And with all of the retouching complete, it's time for the application of the final varnish. And here I'm going to use a slightly different technique than I normally do. Yes, I will brush it out with my bristle brush. I'll apply the varnish on the painting, go back and forth, and make sure that I have a nice even coat. And then as the solvent in the resin evaporates and the varnish becomes stiffer or dries, I'll brush it out a little bit more. Then when it's reached a point of almost completely dry and really tacky, I'll switch to my badger hair brush and I'll start adding a very fine texture. This is a glossy varnish, and if I leave it glossy, it might look too shiny or plasticky. But doing this technique, adding a slight texture to it as it dries, gives it a really beautiful crystalline effect. And for a small painting like this, where you're going to view it really closely, I think it's really, really gorgeous. Well, good morning, John.
Good morning.
So let's cut right to the chase. Here she is.
Oh my. That looks really, really good.
She does, doesn't she?
Yeah.
The painting responded pretty well. We didn't run into too many surprises. With any old painting, there's always a certain number of unknowns that you have to tackle along the way, and you try to control for them. And this one gave us a couple of surprises, but nothing that we couldn't handle. Ultimately, though, I think she responded really well. I mean, she looks like herself, just brighter and better, which is what we wanted, which is what we always hope for, that a painting responds that way, that we don't find that she really had a beard or, that, the whole face was overpainted or anything like that.
But nonetheless, you can see a lot of detail, like the fur around her sleeve was almost invisible initially.
Right.
And now you can see that she is, in fact, wearing fur over her shoulder.
And her hair covering back here was almost completely blended in with the background. And so even when the changes are really subtle, they actually matter quite a bit.
Right,
and you get color definition, you get depth, you get contrast out of it. And where that is missing, the painting often looks flat and lifeless. And so getting some of that gamut back makes a big difference. And so I think that's where this painting really succeeded. And of course, on the bottom, we had some losses where the frame had abraded it. Those are all touched up now. Per your request, we did have the painting x-rayed. We took ultraviolet and infrared photography. And I had emailed that to you before so that you could see it. I wanted to ask from you is what you were expecting to see from those images.
Mostly I wanted to confirm that there wasn't an underlying image.
Okay.
That this was not something, a portrait painted atop something else.
Reworked or repurposed.
Reworked or entirely repurposed.
Right.
Because you do see instances where you'll have, let's say, a pastoral scene that somebody comes back and paints a portrait over it.
Tell me about it. Yeah, we see it a lot. Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure that that was not the case to begin with. And then secondly, with the infrared reflectography, I wanted to see if there was any evidence of a pattern having been used or of the artist's original sketch in charcoal.
In a sense, what you were looking for was, or what you were hoping to find was nothing.
Correct.
I always tell people when we have paintings x-rayed and photographed like that, sometimes the best case scenario is finding nothing. And they don't often understand that. And they say, well, aren't we using this to find the smoking gun, the thing? And I tell them, well, oftentimes when you find the smoking gun, it's not a good thing.
Correct.
It turns out to be a problem. So sometimes finding nothing is exactly what we want, which is why when we initially communicated about that, and in our communications, you said that you had some information that you wanted to share with me.
I do. One of the issues, because this painting was painted sometime between probably 1625 and 1640, the question arises, is it a copy of a pre-existing painting? In the art history world, that's a sort of a cliche now. It's a copy of a lost original, copy of a lost original. You hear that all the time. As it happened, I was watching another YouTuber, Alan Barton's The Antiquary channel, and just the weekend after I dropped the painting off, and he was doing a talk that he ended up putting up two portraits, one of Henry VIII and one of Catherine Aragon. And I came out of my chair. This is the original. It's in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston.
Wow, look at that.
And it's attributed to Johannes Corvus, and it dates to the 1520s.
Wow, that is as close to a dead ringer.
And then this is the same image, but a much lighter copy. This copy is actually after this.
Oh, wow.
This body was copied from this body. And you'll notice her hands are in precisely the same position.
I mean, You take an overlay, it probably matches up almost to a T.
Well, the heart-shaped pendant
Yeah, the heart-shaped
is exactly
pendant.
the same. The jewelry across the bodice trim is exactly the same. The fur is the same. The way the fur lays across the arms is
The type of pattern.
The pleating of the foresleeves is the same, though he altered the color. And in Catherine of Aragon's portrait, you can just make it out. The embroidery depicts pomegranates, which was her personal emblem. And in this, it's been changed to a 6-petal flower.
Okay.
So little changes. The
Yeah.
sheaf of wheat denoting fertility has been removed.
Right, well,
and a
of
thumb
course.
ring placed over the spot where that
Right.
sheaf once was. And then a ring has been added to the forefinger.
Right. So
here.
little details to differentiate her from this painting. Wow, that is a good eye. Yeah.
Now, where this face came from, I do not know. My suspicion is that it's a generic female face
Okay.
and not a specific individual. It's certainly not Jane Grey.
So after all of that research, after all of this work, after the whole process and journey, what's next for this piece?
I very much want it to be on public display in a British setting.
I see.
This painting does not belong in America, and it needs to be before the public eye, I think.
So, John, the hunt for the true Lady Jane Grey, the 9-Day Queen, seems to continue. Tell me what's next.
Well, there's about 36 portraits of her, none of which are her.
Of course.
My own feeling as someone who spent 25 years researching portraiture of her is that there is no life portrait of Jane Grey and never will be.
Right. Forgive me because I'm not a historian. It seems to me that so much of history is the constant debate about what is impossible to determine, which is the capital T truth.
Right.
Right? Like,
What is truth?
What is truth? And after you and I are gone, new people will come along and say that we were wrong.
Yes.
And here's the evidence why. And then new people will come along and say, well, they were wrong and those guys were right. So it's this fascinating, kind of never-ending game of kind of keeping on probing and probing and probing. I would presume that through all of this probing, through all of this research and writing and discussion, that what we're really trying to get is not the capital T truth of the facts of the history. We're trying to get to the truth of humanity, of something about ourselves.
Right.
Yeah, which, I don't know, that's a bigger conversation for this day, I guess. So, it turns out that this may not be the lost portrait of Lady Jane Grey. And while that may seem disappointing, for a historian like John, there is no bad result. Every piece of evidence furthers our understanding of who she was and why she captured our attention. And in the process of researching this work, John was able to piece together how it came to be, an assemblage of different paintings. And as for the painting itself, well, gone is the thick layer of synthetic and natural resin varnishes and grime that were causing the painting to be discolored and keep us away from this portrait. All of the losses and scratches and scuffs have been retouched, and the painting now looks like a painting. We can appreciate the image for whoever it is, while the hunt for the real Lady Jane Grey, the 9-Day Queen, continues.